Whittaker and Thomas will play our opening hymn, number 44, We Sing of Golden Mornings. Thank you. Of course, that's Whittaker, Locke on the piano and Thomas Trinh on the flute. We're glad that you're here for our regular Sunday service at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus. We start our services by lighting the chalice, which symbolizes reason, tolerance, and freedom, and also justice, compassion, and love. I don't think we've mentioned in a good while, this particular chalice was donated to us, dedicated by Norm Harofker, who was a president of our fellowship, a longtime member, and he went on to become the minister of a Unitarian church in Halifax. Thank you, Dick. Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's still there. Again, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus. We're an inclusive spiritual community of people who support each other in their personal searches for truth and meaning. I'm Ron Ussery, your volunteer service leader. Our speaker today is our friend John Kamisky. You've known John for his years as a member of this congregation in very active fashion. I'll remind you more about John later, and probably a fact or two you don't know about John. Whittaker and Thomas will offer more music as well. We'll move on to our offering. We are grateful to be here now. We're grateful for the volunteers who serve us every week to make this service possible. And we're grateful for all the members who work behind the scenes with small groups and for the outreach programs we offer to ourselves and to our community. We support our community as contributors in our own way. You can mail offerings to UUFC at P.O. Box 698, Fortson, Georgia, 31808, or use PayPal. To use PayPal, click the Send Money tab and put it as the recipient, our email address, uufca@gmail.com. And of course, you can also use the old-fashioned way of putting your item in the plate. So Whittaker and Thomas will now play Prelude from Suite Burma Mask. Is that, how do you say that?
Bergamasque.
Bergamasque. I misspelled it in my notes. By Claude Debussy. What a treat. So let me introduce our speaker. John hails from Pine Mountain now, but he originally comes from Nyack, New York. You probably have heard of Nyack, even though it's a very small town of about 7,000 people. John was raised Roman Catholic in Nyack. If you've driven across the Tappan Zee Bridge, is it 271? Interstate 271, I think it is. Just above, it bridges across the Hudson River just above New York. Then you've been at least by Nyack, if not to it. Other famous Nyack citizens have included Helen Hayes, Dennis Hopper, Toni Morrison, Rosie O'Donnell, and of course, another Columbus connection, Carson McCullers. Nyack was Carson's second home. John was an altar boy back home, so he was the real deal. He went on to study liberal arts and engineering at St. Michael's College, Vermont in 1958, graduating there. He earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering at NYU in 58 and 1964. He also received an MS in transportation at the University of South Carolina in 1971. John's had the opportunity to travel the globe. He lived in Japan, where he studied Shinto and Judo. He first visited Callaway Gardens in Pine Mountain in 1967 and was very impressed, winding up moving to Pine Mountain in 2003. He is active in Habitat for Humanity, the Pine Mountain Trail Association, and he's been a volunteer fireman for 22 years. He also enjoys tennis, reading, and greenhouse activities. He's a professional engineer, an Air Force veteran, and he considers himself to be a, what kind of socialist? Socinian socialist. John.
Thank you very much, Ron.
I need to correct the screen, it's not showing.
We sing of golden mornings, we sing of sparkling seas, of parties and valleys and mountains and stately forest trees. That's the song we first heard from Whittaker and Thomas this morning, We Sing of Golden Mornings, by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thank you and welcome to Grace Hall. This presentation may be a little different than others here at Unitarian Universal. I'm going to show you on the screen several slides with no comment, initially for your perusal. These slides are randomly selected from thousands that are available from the Transcendental movement, and then begin the presentation. The first. You now know as much as I know about Transcendentalism. Any questions? Prologue. 70 decades ago, I was on a stage presenting a speech for an oratorical contest. And it began, "The president should be impeached." This is not from a recent turn of events in our political history, but its roots back to the 1870s with President Andrew Johnson, and further back to President Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. Back then, the transition from political, religious format culminated in many divisions, one of which was led by a group known as the Transcendentalists. Transcendentalism. Is it a new philosophy or religion? It certainly was a reaction to the strictness and concentration of the concept that we are all sinners in the concept of Calvinism at the time, which was important in New England. It has its roots in Kant's Novenia and John Locke's skepticism of organized religion. By definition, Transcendentalism is asserting the acceptance of an ideal spiritual reality that transcends empirical and scientific reality and is knowable through intuition. This concept emerged as part of the American Renaissance, circa 1820 to 1880. It emphasized the divine in nature, the value of the individual and the human intuition, and an ideal spiritual reality that transcends sensory experience and provides a better guide for life than the narrowly empirical and logical reasoning. The term refers to a cluster of concepts set forth by a number of individuals rather than a fixed or formal philosophy. And I know there are many educators out there, and you should and probably will take exception to this concept of everything is intuitive in education. Transcendentalism is a very simple idea. All people have knowledge about themselves, the world around them, that transcends or goes beyond what the five senses tell them. Knowledge through intuition and imagination, not through logic or science or the senses. The Transcendentalists understood that people should trust themselves to be their own authority on what is right. These are not religious beliefs, but a way to understand life's relationship. They had a faith that all would be well because humans could transcend all limits and reach astonishing heights. Education was essential to transcendental ideas. In general, almost everything they were against. How they lasted, who knows? They were against government, organized religion, laws, social institutions, and industrialization. It's a wonder that the experiment lasted as long as it did. It was actually an American Renaissance. Is this also what happened in the 1960s and 70s, which you were a part of, with the hippies and the music poets? In 100 years hence, will those present consider that period as the new American Renaissance? This brief talk is not meant to be a correlation between Unitarianism and Transcendentalism, although many of the personages of the Renaissance were members or actual preachers of in the Unitarian Church. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a deist and believed that God was in every man and that there was divinity in nature. He was a disciple of Kant and Coleridge. And if you ever try to read Kant, it's way beyond my concept, but they followed Kant religiously, in the European manner. Rather than go into any detail of the lives of the primary subjects, namely William Ellery Channing, Ralph Waldo Emerson, or David Thoreau, I'm going to change this, and I would like to explore the influence of the feminine side of the movement and what and where and how they influenced Transcendentalism during that period. Transcendentalist thinking was a women's movement. at least in the minds of many of its practitioners. Men in the movement supported women, worked side by side with them, and argued for their rights. Women, just as importantly, seized the mantle of their own authority and argued for their own causes, namely religious freedom, the abolition of slavery, women's personal rights to own property, which at that time they were not allowed to have, cast votes, and control their own destinies. Currently, if we were to read the tabloids or look at the news broadcast of CBS, CNN, and even Fox, what would be the main discussion points? Race relations, slavery and abolitionists, taxes, education, how to teach history. That's current and the front burner of the tabloids now. The poor and needy. How about immigrants? Women's rights, environmental awareness, globalization, and materialism. Well, every one of these subjects were on the front burner of Transcendentalist. Let us look at a woman whom most of us know, Louisa May Alcott. She reminds us often that Transcendentalist was a family affair. As the author of Little Woman and the lesser-read Little Men, Louisa was an influential member of the Transcendentalist. She was also part of the families that lived at Fruitland, an experimental community, which was a commune, that lasted less than 1 year. She spent long hours in Emerson's library, which was one of the most extensive in New England. She was a Civil War nurse, which was an emotional charged experience, which led her to write on several charged subjects during her career. She was the first woman to vote in Concord, Massachusetts. Like many in the community, by 1847, Louisa's family housed a fugitive slave. As a sidebar, and this is interesting to me, and to indicate some thoughts about the feelings of others about the group, her mother, describing the community at Fruitlands, was that the only working animals were the women on the farm. The image that left an impression on Louisa was that women worked relentlessly so that the men could wander the landscape and with deep in profound thought. Her closeness to the Emerson family led her to the first book, Flower Fables, written in 1854. As a side, Charles Dickens noted in his trip to the United States that whatever was unintelligible would certainly be a transcendentalist. Our own Edgar Allan Poe said that it was easy to write like a transcendentalist. Use small words and turn them upside down. Her most famous work, Little Woman, presented a new version of the American family and set American values linked to transcendentalists. They were self-awareness, resilience, and resourcefulness. Alcott's social conscience was evident in her attendance to the 1875 Women's Congress in Syracuse, New York. This was, as I had seen in other research, was a hallmark group for women's rights. From Louisa May Alcott, we move to Margaret Fuller, whose name is synonymous with several of the main currents of Transcendentalism. She was a quick learner, bright, studious, and at an early age was translating Goethe into English, and took over the education of her siblings after her father's early death. She was a teacher at Bronson Alcott's Temple School, then as a magazine writer, and first editor of The Dial, one of the first transcendental magazines. She was a writer for Horace Greeley at the New York Tribune and a foreign correspondent. Her publications included The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Women versus Women, which was eventually renamed Women in the 19th Century. This was a major work arguing for equal rights for women. She was a pioneer for women's rights in thought and practice. By 1881, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, by the way, her remembrance birthday was 2 days ago, would claim that Fuller possesses more influence on the thought of American women than any woman previous to her time. By the 1960s, the modern women's movement had revived intense interest in Fuller's life and works, and she is now taught in many college classes. Many of the New England families produced women of note. Emerson's family had several important women: Mary Moody Emerson, his intellectual and puritanical aunt, his wife Lydian, and his daughter, who inspired Alcott to write her first book. The Alcott family produced not only Louisa May, but a sister named May, a well-known artist, two other sisters who figured in Little Women. Reverend William Ellery Channing's daughter attended the Peabody Sisters School and helped bring Channing and Elizabeth Peabody together. The Peabody parents produced a powerful group of daughters. Elizabeth Peabody attended a school run by her mother and encouraged girls in literate skills and fulfillment of their destiny. By 1839, Elizabeth published Jones Very Poems and Essays and became one of the first women publishers in America. In 1859, Elizabeth adapted the ideas of Frederick Frobisher, into the beginnings of the kindergarten movement in America. She rejected the discipline based on fear, as Alcott had done, but differed with Alcott on other matters of education. She was an advocate for rights for Native Americans and supported political refugees from Europe. A third sister, Sophia, is best known as the wife of Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was an accomplished artist and illustrator and well-traveled. Her insights and transcendental ethos are evident in a quote from her journal describing a morning in the forest. And I quote, "I held my breath to hear the breathing of the Spirit around me. Man has a universe within him as well as without." 20 years later, Thoreau said the exact same words. Numerous other women warrant emphasis that were influenced by the Transcendental movement. Lydia Marie Child, best remembered for the poem and song, "Over the River and Through the Woods." Carolyn Dow, a child prodigy, advocated improved prison conditions, treatment of the insane, and public health. Her 75-year journal was one of the most complete records of women's life in the 19th century. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I've mentioned before, organized the first women's rights convention in the United States of America in Seneca Falls, New York. From this came the demand for equal rights, better work conditions, and education opportunities. Lucretia Mott was co-founder of the Seneca Falls Convention after she was refused to be seated at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic after a visit to the Union Army camp on the banks of the Potomac River. It followed the tune of John Brown's Body. His truth is marching on. It's a transcendental idea. A divine spirituality is embodied in a religious and social action designed to make men and women free. The link between transcendentalism and education is a close one. All of the major transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, Palmer, Alcott, Brownson, and Very, and others, spent years in the classroom as teachers and all found the experience inadequate and stultifying. Education at this time was not just a function of the public and private schools, but of the pulpit, the lecture hall, the experimental community, and private tutors. For transcendentalists, all minds were active creators of their experience. This idea contributed to a democracy of thought in which each person was a potential artist or social reformer. Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott, Peabody gave credit to the young for the value of their innocence. their intuitive insights, and their inherent wisdom, unlike all earlier views of children. Such idealism comes from the Platonic notion that knowledge already exists in the mind, and as in the story of Socrates teaching a slave boy geometry. Important educators influenced by Transcendentalism were Francis Parker, founder of the PTA and development of the primary schools. John Dewey called Parker the father of progressive education. Maria Montessori, who agrees that education needed to focus on the inner dimensions of the growing child. Note that the Latin word for education is educere, which means to draw out what already lies within. In conclusion, the Transcendental movement, although few, if now, would ever claim to be one, has had a direct effect on a wide range of literary, social, and political movements. Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. are direct philosophical descendants of Thoreau, ecumenism, women's rights, and environmental awareness. Our own Unitarian Universal Church acknowledges a crucial role played by Transcendentalists in the development of its individualized and humanistic theology. Transcendentalism in America was initially a movement of younger people whose ideas were passed on to the young and old alike. Often, these ideas were transformed or adapted in important ways. Number one, possibly, race relations in our own era owe a debt to the abolitionist and enthusiasm of Thoreau, Channing, Stephen Douglas, and Conway. Arguments for women's rights trace to Fuller, the Peabody sisters, and their supporters. Communal living remains an ideal for social movements, ranging from the hippies to religious cults. Current emphasis on globalization links to transcendentalism, ideas about the unity of all people and the value of cross-culture communication, which is one of our 7 principles. The environmental movement, whether it draws on scientific, Native American, Christian, Judea, or Eastern ways of thinking, links the anti-materialism at the heart of transcendentalism. And finally, when people attack the persuasive materialism of our own culture, and they often refer to Thoreau, and I quote, "A man is rich in proportion to the number of things that he can afford to let alone." Epitaph. When you have an opportunity, please look at the framed picture in the back left-hand corner for me, the right coming in, of the Unitarians on the right wall of the Grace Hall, and you will find most of all the characters which I have mentioned today in this presentation. Most of this presentation is from one of the great courses titled Emerson, Thoreau, and the Transcendental Movement, presented by Professor Ashton Nichols. The CDs for this and the course guidebook will be available in our library within the next 2 weeks. Please pay close attention to the bottom right-hand corner picture in the tabloid over there in the back. It's one of the most important characters of the Unitarian Universal Church. Thank you for your attention. You're welcome.
Thank you, John. It occurs to me that Eric Maddox would have enjoyed today's presentation and would have probably taken part in the discussion. A couple of you mentioned my wearing a suit, which I don't think I've ever done in this building before, unless it was a funeral. This suit I'm wearing in honor of Eric. It was Eric's, which Mona asked me if I would be interested in wearing, and I'm honored to do so. Our closing hymn will be hymn number 79, "No Number Tallies Nature Up," that Emerson wrote.